Why would they need all this? Meaning, why would they need a special place to stand, send people out, have them call, ask the question, the whole Mishnah? Why do you need all that? Just, like we said, normally you can calculate when day starts. Usually if you know, you can calculate when the day started yesterday, so the next day is perhaps a minute or two off, depending on the time of year. But you could pretty much calculate how it is. So why would they need all this? Because one time there was light that came up towards the end of the night, and they thought that this light was the light of the sun, and they thought it was in fact the time for the shechita. But in fact, instead of being the light of the sun, it was ma'or halavana. It was light that emanated from the moon. It was a reflection from the moon. V'dimu she'ir hamizrach. They thought, they were under the impression that the sun had come up, that this was the light of the east from the sun, and in fact it wasn't. This is really just the way that the moon had been placed. So the moon had given off light that made it appear that way, and in that case, shachatu tatamid. They in fact did shchita on the korban tamid, the first korban of the day. Every single day was a korban tamid. As soon as it would be light enough, they would bring the korban tamid. And in this case, so now that the light had come up, they brought this korban, thinking that it was daytime already. Once you did that, once you brought a korban at the wrong time, so then v'hotziuhu lebeit hasreifa. They ended up having to bring that korban to the beit hasreifa. They ended up bringing the korban out to be burned. A korban that's brought at the wrong time is not kasher. You're not able to use that korban. It's not valid. You have to bring a different animal as the korban tamid, and that korban cannot be burned in the Beit Hamikdash. It would have to be burned outside just to get rid of it in the proper way of burning it, which is obviously not something you want to do. You don't want to have something that you bring on the mizbeach, or even that you just do shchita on, as something that's kodesh, and then have to turn around and burn it outside the Beit Hamikdash and have it be pasul. So therefore, in order to avoid that, and because that once happened, we have specific people set aside to look very, very carefully and make sure it is absolutely light outside. The sun is absolutely begin illuminating, it's dawned, before we actually do any of the shechita in the Beit HaMikdash. Of course, we're focusing here on Yom Kippur, but the same thing would be true on any day that you want to make sure, you want to know that in fact dawn has come, Alot HaShachar has reached, before you go ahead and you bring any korban. Okay, at that point, once you know that in fact it is dawn, and once you know it is light out, and once you know that we're ready to go and the day has begun, so you take the Kohen, Horiduhu Kohen Gadol lebeit HaTfilah. You take the Kohen Gadol and you bring him down to the Beit HaTfilah. Tfilah, of course, refers to being tovel into a mikveh, and that's what happened. There's special mikveh in the Beit HaMikdash, a special bath with water that wasn't touched by, or wasn't arranged by human beings. It was natural rainwater that fell there, and he would immerse himself in the mikveh. Okay, so that was the first immersion, the first tefillah of the day of Yom Kippur. We're going to see soon that there are many, many tefillot that the Kohen does as part of the avodah on Yom Kippur. The Mishnah continues, Zahaklal, this is the rule, Hayab HaMikdash. There was a rule that was in the Beit HaMikdash, Kol HaMesich et Raglav Ta'un Tefillah. Anyone who literally moves his legs, has a bowel movement, so he needs Tefillah. Even if he was tahar beforehand, it's not something that normally makes someone tamei, but in the Beit HaMikdash there's a special level of purity that's necessary, and therefore anyone who has a bowel movement must have a regular tefillah in the mikvah. V'kol hamatil mayim ta'un kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. Anyone who urinates So he needs kiddush yadayim reglayim to mekadesh, literally to sanctify. It means here to wash with water. According to some, it's water from the kior, special water that was set aside in the kior, one of the kelim in the Beit Hamikdash containing water that Kohanim and Levim would use always to wash their hands and feet. Kiddush yadayim reglayim, to sanctify their hands and their feet. That was what was necessary. They wouldn't have to go and do a full tefillah, but they would have to do kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. They would have to wash their hands and feet before going back to doing any form of the avodah. So again, the Kohen Gadol, once it was light out, before beginning anything, would be tovel, would go into the mikveh, and any person, and the Kohen Gadol as well, on the day of Yom Kippur, would have to go to the mikveh anytime they have a bowel movement and anytime they urinate. So then that would have to be kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. All of this signifying the special sort of treatment that one must have when going into the mikdash. Just like we were careful in terms of the timing of the bringing of the karban, knowing exactly that it was the right time. So too, the mikdash itself has to have this level of kedusha. One has to act with the proper sanctity and respect for it. Therefore, one can't just walk in. One, in fact, has to. The Kohen Gadol can't just start the avodah, but he has to do tefillah beforehand. In fact, as Mishnah Gimel continues, Ein adam nichnas la'azara la'avodah afilu tahar ad sheitbo. A person cannot go in to the azara. Meaning any person, anytime, can't go into the azara in order to do any sort of service, even if he's tahor. The person is absolutely tahor in every way. He's not coming in contact with the dead body or the animals that are tmeim, or has nothing with his own body that made him tamei. Nothing, no issues of tumah. But still, before he goes into the Beit HaMikdash, he must immerse in the mikveh. He must be tovel in order to keep the special level of sanctity of the Beit HaMikdash. So no person ever goes in without going to the mikveh first. As we said earlier, the Kohen Gadol must do tefillah first before he begins his avodah in Yom Kippur. And therefore, if the Kohen Gadol, the Torah tells us he must do tefillah various times throughout the day, but one of them being the beginning of the day. So to any regular person, a regular Kohen, who goes in to do any sort of avodah in the Beit HaMikdash also must begin with this tefillah as well. And then the Mishnah concludes, Chamish tefilot v'asara kiddushin tovel Kohen Gadol u'mekadesh bo bayom. There are 5 tefillot, 5 times he does tefillah in the mikvah, v'asara kiddushin, and 5 times he does this sanctifying of his hands and feet, as we spoke about earlier, washing his hands and feet with the water of the kior, that the Kohen Gadol does, u'mekadesh bo bayom, on that day, of course referring to the day of Yom Kippur, v'chulan b'kodesh al beit ha'parva, and all of them would have to be not just anywhere. You can't just go to any mikvah in a regular place, but it has to be in place of Kiddusha, meaning in the Beit HaMikdash, specifically Beit HaParva, one of the sections of the Beit HaMikdash known as the Beit HaParva, which is where the Kohen would go in order to do these tefillot and this Kiddushim throughout the day. He would do part of the Avodah, and then as prescribed by the Torah, he'd be tovel to the mikveh, or he would do kiddush yadayim v'raglayim, depending on what's necessary between the various karbanot of the day, in order to separate between the karbanot he brought for himself, for the Kohanim, for Bnei Yisrael, all the different things that he would do. So he would separate them with a tefillah, again representing the sanctity of the day. That again and again throughout the avodah there was this type of kiddusha that was guarded through constantly being tovel. And the Mishnah says, the last 3 words, chutz mizu bilvad, except for this one, This one meaning the first one that we started out the Mishnah talking about, the beginning of the day before the Kohen would go in. So this one would be outside the Beit HaMikdash. It can be by the Sha'ar Mayim. The Sha'ar Mayim was the gate where he would go in to the Beit HaMikdash. There was also a mikveh, and there the Kohen would go in. It's interesting, those people who have been to Yerushalayim have seen the excavations, some of the archaeology there, so very often they find places, a famous burnt house in the old city of Yerushalayim, where there are very many baths. They call them ritual baths, obviously they're mikvahs, which is because, exactly as we see in this Mishnah, that to be tovel in the mikvah is specifically around the Beit HaMikdash was something very common and very frequent, and something we had to do in order to maintain the kedusha of the Beit HaMikdash. And therefore, even though in this day of Yom Kippur, most of the tefillah were in the Beit HaMikdash, but on any other day, and certainly a tefillah before one came into the Beit HaMikdash, that would not be in the Beit HaMikdash itself, that would be outside the Mikdash, and therefore it's important to have the mikveh available. So here we have these first three Mishnayot describing how we know the day beginning, making absolutely certain it's a proper time to begin the avodah, and then the Kohen preparing himself, physically cleaning his body, in order to make him tahor to begin the avodah process in the Beit HaMikdash.